Hey guys, we are live and we are here to talk about some interesting things today, some big changes. One of the core things I want to embrace is building in the open, and no better person to help me talk about being open and thinking thoroughly about the MSP ecosystem and AI than Jeffrey Newton. Thanks for joining me, Jeffrey.
Hey, absolutely. As always, super happy to be back here. This little pet project has become just such a fascinating experiment in some ways, and also, experiment almost doesn't give it the gravity that it deserves, but uh, the real time lessons learned, which I think is probably where some of our conversation will go today as well. Um, and so, I love the opportunity to have the conversation with you and also bring the learning and the experience and the discoveries that you're finding through this kind of first time out the gate process that you're going through, looking for the AI ops role.
Yeah, it's really been interesting as I think through it from my perspective because I put more work into this than normal in terms of even the job description. Just trying to figure out how can I get somebody that's not a senior machine learning engineer that's 500K, that's not in the budget. Yet how do I get somebody that is can really be effective, right? And even the job description and thinking through that before the job description, it was how do I boil that down and how do I word that? Because you can't go back to the playbook. At least I couldn't hear and say I want this kind of college degree. I don't think there's a degree I'm looking for that would cover this. And I certainly really couldn't look for a ton of experience in this particular area. In fact, I had a number of applicants comment on that they felt like this was forward-looking and that an AI ops role will be pretty standard in 6, 12, 18 months. So that was some interesting feedback. So now I guess big picture, we've gone from hundreds of applicants to, and I can talk about the process in between, but we're at the final 4. So I can talk about that, but also just a few things hit me out of left field that I didn't expect.
Yeah, and I do want to dive into those, and part of where I want to go and like how I want to even acknowledge that that's a possibility in the conversation is we're in this sector of time where like it's almost, well, one, we have to admit that we don't know what we don't know, right? And the reason is because the era that we are operating in, like none of us have operated in before. To your point about like you can't go to the playbook because a playbook doesn't exist. And so full on, I think acknowledging that and admitting that is the first step in like a willingness to take the risk. Then kind of evolving through that is like you were at that point, which is what led you to think about repurposing kind of the vacant assistant role and turning it more into how could we bring in the first AI ops role. And we've talked at length before about how you were able to get so many applicants, which I think if anyone is struggling with hiring, go back and listen to the prior conversations we've had. We've pretty much exhausted that. And there's a lot of good things in there. And then you get to this point where now that you are having the opportunity to speak to so many people, and in our last conversation, I think it was it's like 15 people, so at least 15 hours basically of your time that you've put into just the one-to-one conversations even, right, of the interviewing process. But one of the things you mentioned that when you opened today's show that I really want to almost tap into is through the lens of you don't know what you don't know, or we don't know what we don't know, and through the lens of how much time you've put into this process firsthand, which is the part that I think I wanted to hit, is that made me immediately think of all the time I spent, those 18 years on different leadership teams at MSPs, where it was like all too often there was this level of frustration or this level of reality where decisions that were trying to be made or wanted to be made or problems that we were attempting to solve, I always felt like it was displaced out of actual reality, right? So we were solving for this thing that was maybe the relevance of the context was lost. That could have been time, or like how long someone was outside of the seat, outside of the role. So to bring it all back on point and like hit that, you are CEO of Servosity, you're engaged in multiple other activities. As a result, naturally, you've sort of evolved out of being maybe the tactician, right, in all of these seats.
Yeah.
You probably took on parts of this hiring process that previously you had people that would handle certain aspects, but instead you really like tore it back down to the roots. And so, one, I want to acknowledge that, like, conscious awareness of your involvement at the tactical ground level, and then from there maybe rebuild some of the things that you didn't know and what you've learned in real time as a result of being the person kind of going through this process. And I'll let you talk through some of that, and then I'm sure I'm going to have questions to learn on my own out of it too.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's interesting for me because I've been obsessed with understanding people, and I do believe that the people are what makes this amazing and different. And so as a kind of first principle, that means the hiring process has to be really good, because who we let on the team changes the culture, which changes basically the whole deliverable, the reason we exist. And we can have a great reason to exist, but if we don't execute well because we've got the wrong people on the team, then we're in big trouble. So I've spent over a decade obsessing about the process and the people and trying to understand that and do that in a very unconventional manner. I think that has helped. In other words, we tended to attract more people of neurodivergence and with a higher degree of unconventionality and all sorts of other kind of colorful commentary I'm happy to expand on if anybody's interested. But there were a few lessons really learned here, even after a decade or more of not just hiring, but a decade over obsessing over the process. And when I say that, I mean, it was about a decade ago, I started treating the hiring process as a continual loop, such that every job ad was A/B tested, such that every time we hired end to end, we looked at that and said, how do we make this better? How do we make it more, how do we not only make it more effective and efficient, which is kind of a normal lens, but how do we make it more us? How do we make it more fun? We do all kinds of unconventional things in the hiring process that people are like, this is the most fun I've had on an interview. This is really get to know you guys. And it makes it more fun for us, but also the right people, they lean in even further once we've had that first conversation. One of the points that I'll start with, and I can go into more, is a really high number of these people, of course, as you'd expect, used AI to apply and to format their resumes and do all those things, probably everyone. But a really high number said, how are you using AI in your recruiting process? And in our rush to do this, in my decision, and just to be clear, most of the problems I've created. I could have waited longer, but I decided the timing's now. Let's go do this and make this hire. And I don't love our applicant tracking system and some of the way the workflows and processes work, but it's probably average. It's not. Yeah. I'm not saying it's deficient, but it's not rethought with the speed in mind. And so we saw a lot of applicants and a lot of back and forth. And so it was interesting to see. They were like, well, what are you doing from that angle? How are you making this better? And it's kind of funny because I feel like we attracted people that were wanting to optimize and fix the very process they were going through. Not complaining about it, but just like already seeing and thinking from like a systems thinking kind of methodology.
Yeah. That's the systems thinking component of that's pretty fascinating, just from having spent more time, one, figuring that out myself and leaning into it and understanding perhaps a structure and a framework that I didn't know existed before that overlapped really well with something that I was really familiar with, which is continuous iterative improvement. Geez. Because that's kind of how my brain's always wired too, where like things are either in the front of my brain or the back of my brain, but things are never really out of my brain, which is kind of a loud place to live sometimes too. But the continuous part is like, one, you have to start, and two, you never really end. So like you will keep coming back to making it better and better over time. And systems thinking has really given me like a common vocabulary internally here at SIFT where we can look at things through that lens as well. And I almost wonder too, because you mentioned like the people that happened to go through the process were wanting to innovate, improve, or iterate, or, make it slightly different, maybe better, maybe worse, who knows, but just like predisposed to maybe see the world through systems might be the way to put those words in your mouth.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much of that is the result of like how you cast the net to get the right person into the process. And then maybe another component of that too is that the type of mind that you were looking to introduce to the team or continue to scale the team out with.
Yeah. So I want to jump off one thing you just said, which is like that how you cast the net. And I think that really, not only do I think, but I've got somebody they use that helps with the hiring that's amazing and both understands people, but also like a statistician. And so based on, as we got into later stages, for example, all the final applicants were as high as essentially the assessments, we did assessments as well, go on the love of learning so high that the word for that is scholarly. So, there's different levels of that, and they were all at the, extreme. And it's a fairly rare thing to capture in the wild. It's a few percent out of 100. And so he ran the probability of all of the 15 that we kind of boiled down to before we got down to the final 7 and final 4 being scholarly or incredibly wired to love learning and be essentially insatiably curious. And
I got a question on that then, because this is something that I've observed in different personality types over time, but I've never really figured out a way to see if you can detect it, quantify it, measure it, or whatnot. But one of the traps to being addicted to the learning part of it, like the dopamine of discovery, rather than how you make any of that applicable, right? So like the applied knowledge piece versus the just gaining knowledge piece. Have you found a way to test for the counterbalance to being scholarly? Like, it's great that you are in love with the discovery of context or of information, but then how can you peg to whether or not this might even not be the right way to cast it, but like come out of the clouds a bit, get your hands on the keyboard and like produce or execute or bring it down to something that's tangible or actionable?
Yeah, so there's a ton of things measured, not only the intellectual curiosity or the love of learning, but also how do you relate things? How do you communicate? How do you apply? And I think that all, because I often oversimplify. I go, well, if you love learning and you do execute, we're good. And especially in a field where you have to learn so much and whatever you knew yesterday is probably, slightly outdated already. But there are different ways in which you communicate it. We're actually measuring your natural orientation versus your current orientation. And really what that means is your best foot forward on your job interview. I'm an introvert, believe it or not. And I'm in loving having this conversation with you. But, in an interview, I might be like, yes, we can do it. And it might be just over the top. And the reason I think that's important is if we're asking you to do something that is not your natural energy, essentially, then over time, you're just going to get exhausted. You're not going to really be able to find joy in that. And that's fine if you just need to do it for a one customer call or an afternoon. But if we put you in a role where that's what you need to do, that's kind of a recipe for failure. So there's a ton to unpack there, but long story shorter, we can understand if that is, if your ability, it's not just a single thing like ability to execute, but your detail orientation, your follow through, and then how natural or how much is that something that you have to reach for?
Yeah, that does remind me. It takes me way back, I don't know, at least 10 years. One of the first places where I got to discover that I didn't want to be a manager because I was one. One of the hiring criteria we had used in the hiring process was I think the test might have been the culture index. I don't even know if I'm allowed to use the names or anything, but the thing that you triggered my brain on was one of the elements that was measured on that one was, it might not be the right language, but again, I attribute it to like energy units or something, which is like how long, like what duration window do you have to be pushed outside your natural state? And it was interesting when we first deployed that questionnaire or survey, whatever it would be, tool to our current team, and then also used it moving forward in hiring, because you could actually see specifically to the energy unit component, like what that showed up like or as realistically in the roles. To your point, like mine, my energy units were off the chart basically on the high side. And so my natural state was I could be pushed outside what I was comfortable with for long periods of time without it being so draining. Whereas others, you could see that, and it wasn't good and it wasn't bad. That was one of the other things I learned about all those tests and stuff. It was just like almost pre-seeing what the expectations are or could be, and then not being surprised by certain outcomes, right? If you put...
I love that, because I think I have two beliefs. One is that we're not here to fix people. They're not broken, in terms of you have strengths, you have different qualities. The other is that I just want to use that as a way to manage that energy, manage that expectation. Yeah. And by not fixing people, what I mean is, my mental model is, if you're incredibly strong in an area, it's like if I build a really big, skyscraper building over here. It's great, it's beautiful, it's huge, it's state of the art, it's whatever you want it to be. You got this great skyscraper, so you have this great outlier strength. But all those skyscrapers create a shadow. And it's not bad, it just is. Like, you can't have a skyscraper and have a smaller building beside it and not be in the shadow at certain times of the day. And so it's not, there's no such thing as a perfect human. I think that it's just, for us and for me personally, it's like trying to understand what is going to be more natural to you, where your strengths lie, where they lie naturally. And then we actually have, it's 3 assessments that come from 3 different backgrounds. So most people kind of get what I would call one-dimensional. So we get a 3-dimensional view of you as an individual. And then we all have been through it. So now we have a 3-dimensional view of everybody on the team. And then the thing that I feel like most people don't do is, we're not hiring in a vacuum. So we look at who, in this case, I'm the manager they'll report to, and what team members are you going to work with, and how are you going to fit into that team. And I don't just mean, will you accept each other? That's usually not an issue. It's just this, what is that going to do to the team dynamic? Because it changes the culture. Every person, I feel like, is either additive or dilutes the culture.
Yeah, that reminds me of another truth that I learned too. My very first mentor, who happened to be mentoring me when I stepped into that management role, but he explained, and I think maybe the formula was for span of control. I think it came out of like corporate management, but at any rate, it was the way he said it is the way that I remembered it, which was, for the number of people, as the number of people that you manage or that are on a team increase algebraically, like the complexity that you need to solve for increases geometrically. And that was never more true than what you just described as team dynamics, where it's like, as soon as you add one more person to the team, even if it's a team of 3, it's not just an additional thing that you're managing. It's the geometric effect of the interpersonal relationships and the relationships on that team, but also on other teams that team happens to relate to or deal with or coordinate or collaborate with. And that was an interesting lesson to watch unfold.
Well, and related to that, again, I go deeper down the rabbit hole maybe than most, but we're using AI for that. And what I mean by that is, depending on whatever assessment you use, there are some that are better, but there are a lot of good ones out there. You either go to an expert, and some of them are better than others to interpret it. maybe you or your team have developed some expertise in interpreting the reports. I know they're in English, but when you look at them, you're like, well, they're great at this. What does that mean? Where does that really mean? How does that show up? And so if you start to ask more in-depth questions, it becomes more nuanced, I think more valuable, but it requires a really good guide, really good interpreter. And then I think, frankly, we're really just drowning in data, but we lack context. And for example, a lot of these reports we're all familiar with. They're 20, 30, 40 pages. They take the assessment, you get this big pile of stuff, and then you go to interview, and then you're probably interviewing at least three candidates who, if you're like me, you're like, well, how does this candidate show up differently than these others? So I'm trying to compare against that. Now you can imagine what we've done is said, okay, well, there's 3 assessments. So now we have 3 30 or 40 page reports. So we got 100 plus pages on an individual. And then we say, okay, let's pair that with the manager and the team. So now we've got, 500 to 1,000 pages of data.
Yeah. Right.
To consider per interview, at least final interview. Like, so for the final 3, we could consider 500 or 1,000 pages of data. And you just can't do that as a human. And I think what I had done before AI was shortcut the process and go, okay, let me look at 1 or 2 or 3 metrics and go, they're not very hungry for learning, or they're not very driven, or, some other thing, and go, well, if they're really horrible in that, let me kind of account for that. And, but now with AI, we're able to feed it this treasure trove of data and ask them. The spoiler that I've learned so far, spoiler alert, is it doesn't make the decisions for me. It doesn't just say, you can't work with Jeffrey or you're going to work great with Jeffrey. It helps me. It gives me a little more information to ask more nuanced questions. Like in this scenario, what would happen and why? Or how would the team respond in this way? Or as we introduce this person to the team and let's say we encounter this challenge. Let's imagine we have a challenge. How are we going to do that? So that's been really interesting for me as a way to use AI in a way that you just really, I think 2 things for me. 1, swimming in data. Like who's going to, like, if you actually read the 30-page report for all your, when you're taking one assessment for all 3 candidates, please drop a comment. I'd love to know that because I don't think I ever did that.
No.
And then you expand that and try to look at it for your team and 3 times as many reports. And it's both something I would never do and now can be done in a better way. And then lastly, this just informs the questions, right? No matter how good, and I believe I'm using some of the best tooling that's state of the art. And I don't mean AI, I mean probably that, but assessments and understanding people. I'm going to use that to guide questions to see if that actually bears out in reality. I don't, it's a little, like I wouldn't trust AI, no offense, or an assessment to say, Jeffrey didn't hit these numbers, so I shouldn't interview him, or I'm not going to make him the offer. But I do use it to say, what are those superpowers created by those skyscrapers? How do I see if those are real? And here's the shadows created, and either I can manage with that with the team, or let me ask some questions to see how real that is, how deep that may go.
Yeah, my experience has sort of taught me with what you're describing. I break it down into like simplifying the Rubik's Cube a bit. And what I mean by that is human to human interaction to me is I just like visualize it as this Rubik's Cube. Like there is a solution to get to the outcome, which is like all the colors line up, the alignment piece, but you just have to kind of keep twisting and turning, which is usually questions and communication until you get to the point where it's aligned. And what I'm hearing you describe is almost like if there were 30 steps to do it, and I'm just making it up, some Rubik's Cube person can challenge me, but if there's 30 steps to do it today, because you have to like qualify and quantify through which ones to turn next, you can really synthesize that. And how I use it too is meaning AI, is to sharpen my thinking and elevate, not even elevate as much as it is refine the context, which I think is the most important word you used, so that instead of it being 30 steps to human discernment, it's only 3. And like I get the rebate on those other whatever, 27 steps. And
Mm-hmm.
now I'm so dialed in on what those 3 questions in this case are going to be, that they're 3 perfectly curated questions to get me closer to the outcome I am seeking for Damien specifically, because it's ran on your data in that case, or,
Mm-hmm.
insert any candidate. And I would say that is one learned experience, perspective to being immersed in AI as much as I am as well, where like it isn't even about it being a tool or like a tool for a solution or an outcome. It's literally just a tool to refine and reflect me, to make me think more clearly or completely with context that I may not be considering. It's kind of what I hear you say there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of, didn't plan this, so I'll put you on the spot.
Yeah.
You've been in MSP in leadership for quite a while. You are a co-founder of Sift AI. You guys are doing some really interesting stuff. But just you personally, how are you getting value out of AI? What are some of the pragmatic uses?
Yeah. It's such a good question, because if I just did a time audit on like the last 12 hours, the use cases and the ways in which I lean into it are vast. But I would say, starting at a macro level, and then I can maybe break it down a little tighter than that. It's very similar to what I just described and how you had described. Like when you're starting with so much data, and maybe I'll go through a normal construct too. So there's like the DIKW pyramid, right? Data, information, knowledge, wisdom. And it breaks down basically how you get the value out of data. I think what's missing off of that particular pyramid is that the real top layer, or the layer that surrounds all of it, is context, back to that word you used. And so the most common way that I'm leveraging it in so many different aspects is to either sift or sort or clean or to curate context for me, so that I can then apply my knowledge on a much narrower, and not even knowledge, but wisdom at the top of that pyramid, like get the right context to now apply my wisdom to that very narrow scope. Now, what does that mean? Making it even more tangible or tactical is when I go through what would be like my personal algorithm of experience on a certain topic. And let's just go with even the way that I think. Maybe systems thinking is a great example. Systems thinking, brand new thing to me as of, 3 months ago. Not thinking in systems so much, but thinking in systems as a book, as a piece of context. How to apply the knowledge is really where the value sits, right? So yes, I read it. Yes, I listened to the audiobook. I do it at the same time because that's how I can input information best. But then there's this whole corpus of information as it relates to thinking in systems that I want to now work with. I want to make it 3-dimensional. I want to pick it up and hold it in my hands to really understand it. And also at the same time, acknowledge that I don't need to know any of it anymore in this world of AI. But I still do as a person, because that's the kind of person that's the way my brain works. So I bring that book into the context window of an LLM. And now I can actually have applied thinking and like critical thinking about a topic that I'm trying to solve for through the lens of systems thinking, and get to the outcomes of, hey, design this process through the lens of systems thinking, so that the output and the deliverable is not only the flow chart with all the inputs, the outputs, the flows, the constraints, the bottleneck, all of that stuff, but what would have maybe taken me 2 weeks of whiteboarding, several conference room conversations, pulling in 5 or 6 other employees to help solve through just creating this flow chart as it sits in a process in the business. I can instead have a really big brain dump of context into everything that's in my head, into the same gated conversation that now I bring systems thinking into. And I say, this is everything that you need to know. Give me your first pass at how you would design this as a system. And then I don't just take the output and say, I guess that's my system now. Go deploy it in the business and hope for the best. I still bring my personal experience into it and say, oh, wait, like that's that's not relevant for this vertical or this sector or this ICP or this problem. And so I can bring my experience and shove it back in, right? And like whittle away at ultimately getting to the end product. But I didn't have to be a 20-year expert in systems thinking. I didn't have to be like a Six Sigma triple black belt or whatever. Like I don't need all that stuff anymore, because when you can bring context into confined interaction, like with an LLM, and then work it backwards, even through additional layers. So like another example, I might, to that same conversation, bring in a first principles thinker, right? Or assemble an advisory board of people that I want to represent certain disciplines to help me think through the problem I'm trying to solve, all inside that conversation. But I never take myself out of the process either.
Mm-hmm.
But I get to, such a better outcome where instead of using continuous iterative improvement for the next year and a half to solve that problem, I can like shortcut most of that and get to a better first draft.
Help me make this pragmatic. Give me an example of something you've used this on and say, I've needed to kind of think through this or figure this out or solve this issue.
Yeah. So probably the most meaningful and most valuable so far for us has been bringing on our VP of product. And she had a very specific way, after 30 years of building product, of aggregating her own data sources and like schools of thoughts and ideologies and experience, right? Like the lived and the loved and the learned lessons. And so part of the process that we went through together was going through, I don't know, it's probably 3 or 4 days worth of, I'll call them interviews, but they weren't interviews. It was literally like experience extraction conversations where I wasn't so much interested in just learning, okay, which books did you study from and apply? Although there were those things. It's like, you've done this for 30 years. So like, where is the nitty gritty, like lessons learned? Where's the scar tissue? How do you think through things? Where's your instincts? And we extracted all of that out in conversation into transcript, right? Of those 3 8-hour conversations, let's call it. But the whole process was really on customer discovery and really refining just customer discovery for building product. And so we were able to take all of that context of all of those conversations and strip it back down, bring in the schools of thought that she was referring to, and essentially build out the brain for her to apply the way she always does things. And then do so through a custom agent that is now pre-built as a 2.0 version of herself. And, that agent doesn't have off days in their mind, right? Like mood and tiredness, all those other things don't affect it at all. And it's preloaded with all of the context of her experience. And, several other things through that agent. But essentially, we built an agent that is her sidekick, if you will, her coworker, where we didn't have to hire 2 full-time employees to run this process, which is how she had done it, at her last place as well. So we get...
So back up 1 second. You were hiring the VP product, but I'm trying to dumb this down for me.
Yeah.
The second employee that would normally do what? Because she joins the VP product, but what's the second person normally doing?
2 different components. One would be really managing elements of the customer discovery process. So one, like aggregating context, first of all, or just like consolidating and making the information consumable. Because kind of to your point, when you have 500 pages of info, like how do you get to the needles in the haystack? Well, if you kind of already know the way that you think about things and think through things, and you have context or like lenses that you want to apply to how to look at all that info, well, it's repeatable and it's done the same way too. And so those were the elements that we could build into agent number 1, which was, when you're listening to customer discovery conversations, you must listen to it through this lens. And then there's multiple. And then through that, we don't need to have a human doing the listening, consolidating, synthesizing, interpreting, but it's way more than just like a meeting co-pilot that sends you an output, right? Because it's so highly trained and tuned on what it's listening for, why it's listening for it. It knows the outcome that we're pushing towards, which is to prepare the VP of product with this set of assets before they go to the next step in their process. And so that's agent number one, is aggregate, synthesize, see, reason, and produce the deliverable to take it to the next step. And then the second agent does a similar process, but through a completely different lens with a different objective, which would otherwise have been like your two assistants, right? Like more like, kind of to your point, making it more tactical, practical. VP of product can now sit and act through a much closer lens to UI and UX, front end and back end, all at the same time, while not requiring 2 or 4 additional people to do it. And we get to the point where we can take the information to the next phase with the next people.
Yeah, tons of nuggets there to sift through. Speaking of that, a lot of people talk about prompt engineering. I've been obsessed over context engineering, and that's a little newer term. What's the even 8 hours times 3 days, 24 hours, in my experience, is probably more than the context window can handle. So is that something your product already solved, or did you have to think through, like, how do I get all this information? But I can't, like, I think that's pretty common. Like, people talk about the context windows are huge in some modern models, and they are, but they're huge until you throw 24 hours of transcripts in it, and then they're not big enough.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because I think the way that my mind works has forced me to be in that situation ever since these tools came out, right? It's like the context windows were never large enough. And so there was always sort of this reverse engineering of working around the limitations. And there's nothing wrong with constraint theory either, but to take you more practically through doing that, because it was way outside of any context window, because this was pre-Gemini million tokens, right? Even though it still would have been too big. It was going through it, ironically enough, the first example that I gave you, where it was like applying systems thinking. This was the reason that I was even looking into systems thinking, was understanding that we needed to systematize the process of customer discovery.
How meta.
Yeah, right. It just needed to be done that way, right? The tools, the technology, the access to context, this is where it all came full circle. We just had to build discovery this way. And so that first example that I shared with you about how I read the book, listened to the book, and then extracted and applied the book of systems thinking. Well, I just built an agent that understood how to think in systems and to produce systems from context. And so those transcripts went through that first, right? Basically breaking it out into the subsystems and then assembling and reassembling its parts. I think one of the most interesting things that anyone can do, it's not even really prompt engineering, it's just asking a different question, is asking the model that you're talking to take a step back, to zoom way out and zoom back in and reassess the output that it gave you. So I just applied a similar context, which was context, and said, okay, here's 8 hours of transcripts. Let's distill it down first. I usually like to use the analogy of Legos. Like, I have to get it down to the Legos first before I can rebuild it into the Death Star. And so using different ways of segmenting the context into smaller chunks, and then breaking that down into the contextually relevant mental models that mattered actually. So now I have 24 hours of transcripts and probably 40 mental models out of all those transcripts, and then taking those mental models through the systems thinking agent to build all these subsystems. And then once I had all those subsystems, think of that as like the colorful instructions that Legos comes with. Now I knew how to build the Death Star. So then it was just reassembling it all into, the one agent or multi-agents that did those tasks that we were trying to build for.
Yeah. So you guys, if you're not taking advantage of this, you're missing out. Context engineering, I think, makes a bigger difference than prompt engineering. But more specifically, most of the people I've talked to, they're like, well, there's the people that think AI can do everything already. And there's some people that think, it's basically the predicting the next word, and that all it really does. It's a grammar corrector or something like that. It's spell
Yeah.
check on steroids. But I found that if you're in that camp, the secret, like if you go say, what do I do for my business, or what do I do for my MSP, or even like in this part of the US or that serve this market, that's not enough context. And so that's why you're not getting good answers. It's one of the reasons. And my point is, you can get a great prompt. Like people can often give those away. But if I took your prompt and then I just gave it, I am an MSP and I do this and I have 10 employees, I sell to people in the city, I'm probably not going to get a great answer. So I think it starts with whether it's recording conversations with your clients, people you're interviewing, whatever that is, of course, with their permission, and distilling, then you can start to distill it down and you can start to get highly relevant answers because it's based on highly contextualized advice. And it took me too long to realize this because I've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on coaching myself. And I look back and I have, brand name coaches that a lot of people would recognize. And some of the best ones weren't necessarily them. And I'm not picking on those. It's just sometimes the ones that were best, that made the biggest impact on my life, they had a little more time. They didn't give me infinite time, but they had a little more context. So the coach I spoke to for 30 minutes a week, they had the context. The one I spoke to for 30 minutes a month or a quarter, their advice had to be a little more general. Now they maybe were more successful in outward measures, but that context really changes what advice somebody might give just as a human. And I think applying that same line of thought to this is brilliant.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the all of the value collectively pools into the context, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absent the context, then there's no substantive value to what's left. And so the thing is really thinking about, and I love that you call it like context engineering. It's really thinking through the specificity of what is it that you're trying to solve and how and to what extent or to what degree, and then applying all of the constraint around it, right? And I think that's the other piece to what you were describing. As you give it additional context, like you are this thing in this area with this objective, and this is the task, and this is the output, and how I want to have it seen, and all of that. If you look at all of the input criteria that you're giving it through the lens of really actually like qualification and omitting all of this other context, then you can sort of take the bookshelf of Encyclopedia Britannica and say, well, I'm really only interested in, December 4th, 1943. And you know exactly which book, which page, and which chapter to get to have only the relevant pieces show up. And that's kind of how you think about the inputs and what you're telling it you do or don't want, is like all you're really doing is shaving off the elements of the LLM that are irrelevant to what it is you're trying to accomplish. And that's something I think that the rest of the world, maybe I shouldn't say it that way, that the majority are sleeping on too, is, once agents hit the market and agentic everything became the newest buzzword, it's sort of like that's where everyone's level of awareness anchored into. And yet, if you really kind of zoom out again and you look at the way technologies have evolved, just like the internet, and like where did the value collectively pool, right? It wasn't in the hardware layer. It ended up being in the application layer where it was applied, right, to use cases. And I don't think it's going to be any different. The way that this AI thing plays out is that, agents certainly have a place and they're not going to go away. But the real true value, in my opinion, or my projection, is going to collectively pool in the SLMs, the small language models that can be applied to very acute areas with high specificity and expertise. And then from there, it's just a matter of coordinating all those working pieces, right? Like agents with SLMs backed by LLMs applied inside certain domains is really where I feel the collective value is going to pool out of where we are, at least with AI.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting viewpoint. One thing that's helped me, just a little quick practical tip, to give it more context. Sometimes I have it and copy and paste this, like you were saying. Here's what this is. Here's more. If you've got your ideal customer profile document or avatar, you can do that. But I realized I was just, I don't know if the word's lazy, but not giving enough context and hoping for better results. I would give it some, but when I sat down, I really knew more. And part of it was just the speed at which I type, which is average, versus the speed at which I speak. So one of the hacks, like, I use Super Whisper, which is only currently on Mac, but there's plenty of apps. And this is not the built-in dictation that just struggles with your words, right? This is just something I hit and I just talk, and it formulates that. I can use it to reply to email, but I can use it to write prompt. And what I love is I can hit this one keystroke and I can sit there, but I can pause. And it doesn't penalize me, and I can think for a minute. And if I have a 10-second gap, that's okay. Nobody's judging me. But I can get all these thoughts out about, you know what, we're doing this. We really have these many people. Here's the constraint. You know what? This is going to happen on Tuesday, so let's take that into consideration. And, next month there's this other hire coming on. Let's think about that and how that, if I use that, I realize I get the thoughts out of my head more, not only faster, but I was just a little lazy because I'm like, here's what I know right now. And I would focus just on the basics, and I would miss that. So there's a lot of little tricks like that, I feel like, that can help open up. And I think what's interesting to me is most of those are marketed as like productivity. They'll say like, you type it 60 words a minute, but you speak at 200. So why not triple your productivity? And I buy that. But what it's helped me realize is like, I won't write as thoughtful of a reply to an email or put quite as much in that prompt or whatever that is, or that ticket, because, I write a little differently than just that. And I can just tap a button and just think, and it pastes it right in there. And then, I review it before I send that. But that's helped me be more intentional. And if the word is lazy, but less lazy, or just more specific in how I give it context.
Yeah. Well, I think the answer lies in, again, that last word that you used, right? I mean, in some ways, that's one of the core ethoses at Sift in how we apply a voice solution to the MSP market currently as well. And it's for the reasons you just described. When you can speak it naturally, as if it's talking directly to your coworker, versus typing it, you use different aspects of your brain.
You're far more formal when you type, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you go through the edit, self-edit, rewrite, write, and you process it completely different than if you're able to just free flow the context, right? And this is very true and can be seen in every single ticket note that's typed, really, right? Like, fixed it 3.5 hours. Now, if you can get away with that at your MSP, then good luck. But like, we've all seen those ticket notes, right? And it's because why? You just spent 3.5 hours actively engaged in high calorie activities, and you want to move on to the next one too. You don't want to stop and spend 15 minutes thinking about how to recreate the last 3 hours of history. And yet, if you could just speak it, or better yet, if it listened to the whole time you were already speaking for those 3 hours, then it's all just going to contextualize it, make those decisions of what to do with it and what's relevant and what's not and where to place it. Then the cognitive load that can come off is really ultimately what you're describing you feel, right? Like the cognitive load to sit and type something versus being able to press and hold a hotkey and speak it is drastically different for a human experience. And as a result, we're still wired just like water flows, which is the path of least resistance. So when you can remove all that friction and just allow you to do the brain dump, and then it gets cleaned up automatically because it had all the context it needed to do it. It functions far better than we do as humans when we have to sit and think and self-edit. And maybe not better, but more efficiently, right? I don't spend 15 minutes writing that email. I spend 15 seconds brain dumping it.
I disagree, right? I mean, my point is, I don't disagree. It is more efficient, but that's a nice to have. What I've gained out of that using voice is I didn't do as much. It was too cognitively demanding. So it wasn't that I got a 5-minute task done in 1.5, which could be true. It's that maybe I spent 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, but I got a lot. I just wouldn't have done it. If I'm being honest and open with everybody, like I would have like, well, it's like the ticket analogy. I'm like, yeah, okay, I can't get away with 3.5 hours. I did a thing, but I will be like, well, I don't know. I updated the firmware on the switch. All done.
Right.
I know more than that. But if I could sit here and just hit, this hotkey and just speak, like, well, I did this and then I did that. And it's like you said, you edit, like when you write that email. So I can jump around. I'm like, well, I started to do that. Oh, you know what? I left out step 2 was this. And then these modern tools will put it in the order. It'll write it 1 through 7, not I talked about 1 through 6 and then forgot step 2. So I can be more natural. And that leads me to tell you all 7, because otherwise I'm like, I did a step. Maybe I'll tell you step 1 and step 7. And that's good enough. And unless somebody comes behind me and is like, no, there's not enough. Just that, like you said, water flows, in the path of least resistance. That resistance is enough to make me realize it's not that I won't reply to you an email, but I might not be as verbose. I may not be as detailed on that ticket, on the email, in that prompt, whatever that is. So I've really, really realized that. We were talking backstage, and before our time's up, I did want to talk about, speaking of changes in flow, what I've learned in this process has really, really struck me, and love you to pull this out a little bit, help me pull this out, Jeffrey. But AI is changing really quickly. And the other truth is, so are my expectations for this role. So unlike any other role, I expected one thing. I actually was pleasantly surprised to not only the quality and not only quantity, but especially quality of the applicants. But I had to go through this journey to figure out what there's both some part of reality once I spoke with people. It's like sitting there going, here's my product and here's what I'm going to charge and here's what it does. And then you go out to the market and you realize, maybe not. Maybe it's a different way. Maybe you have to package that value differently. Maybe you can't get that price. Maybe you should charge them more. And so I felt like that's what that was. And so for me, what I'm admitting openly is I put a lot of work in to say I want more than just a ChatGPT person in terms of like fluent in that. I wanted somebody that can do low code, no code, right? Make or Zapier and 8N. And I thought that's what I would be able to get. And I got that. And they were also good and kind of understood AI, of course. And that way we could set up what I would call workflows. And what I mean by that is when an email comes in, do this automatically. When a ticket comes in, do this automatically. Somebody doesn't have to paste it into ChatGPT, that's the difference in a workflow. It runs the same thing every time. But what I realized is what's changed is 2 things. One, we've gotten some folks that what I would call are like light developers and AI. So I was expecting kind of low code, no code, and I've gotten folks that have kind of coding ability. The other thing that's dawned on me is in the first few months, it's titled AI operations. We're going to do things that improve like all the things we talked about last time. And I'm happy to share with anybody like the ticket triage, productivity, time management, fixing our knowledge base, all these things that we want to do better or faster and never seem to have quite enough time to do. But it's the after that part. Because in the job description, I say, here's the first 90 days. And people raved about, I love the clarity of what success looks like in the first 90 days. And maybe wonder why I ever didn't do that in every other job description. But it was after 90 days when I said, well, we'll pivot and we'll start putting, and this will be part of our product. So you'll kind of join the kind of existing software development team that I have and do more full code, proper commits, all those sort of things. And so what's unfair to the applicants, but it's also not something that I intended to do, is I learned along the way that there are some applicants that have applied that are a little more, have more coding ability, software development ability. But also if we're going to ship things into production, I'm not going to rely on a no-code tool to support production workloads, and you have to be able to support it. You have to be able to debug it. You have to be able to, fix it. And so I think the market evolved. The candidate showed me something else, and I also had to get more clarity around what is the right role. And like you said, I wrote a very specific net, and it cast this wonderful group of scholarly, high-learning people that are amazing. And unfortunately, some of them are amazing people for the job I described, which I no longer need.
Yeah. And is the no longer needing not so much that the problems that you initially set off to solve with it have been solved, right? Like through this process, more your definition of the problem really has evolved and changed.
It's the latter. The definition of the problem has evolved and changed. My discovery of the market is even in this budget range, I can get somebody with light code, and so that's made it more pragmatic or practical. But also, one of the biggest breakthroughs was we had 7 different applicants choose from 1 of 5 projects, and so it turns out it just happened to be pretty much every project was done, and that was stuff I didn't think we could even get done in 90 days. So these people, even people that aren't using full code, the low code, no code tools, were able to, they're proof of concept. They're not fully, debugged and everything, but still in a few days produce more than I imagined. So I had to, in a wonderful way, go back to and kind of look at this and say, wow, we can do so many more things. I think the other thing is, we just know how. Look, I could very well say, look, I'm going to hire one of these folks now, and there's kind of almost no end to kind of internal operational efficiency, using AI and fixing ops. And I think that could work. It's just we had some other applicants that also had some of that coding ability. And because this is our first AI hire, I'm not, rebuilding the entire company all like an MSP. I've got an existing company, and I have existing software developers. And so I know this can influence them and how they work together. And I just think that that next level is going to be better. Sure, maybe I'd love to say, let me go get like a chief data scientist or, a chief of AI or something like that and start with that. But I suspect where we are is a lot like most MSPs, where that's just not in the budget today. And so it was very pragmatic, like what's in the budget? And who's the right role? And so I think this was a little more about people and understanding what their capabilities are and how they've impressed me. They're, I would say either 10x or 100x what people would imagine they could do. And anybody has questions about what are you doing or what can you do, things are automatically analyzing how you're spending your time and recommending ways to improve it and delegate. Who wouldn't want that for every person on their team? And, so many other examples. So it's not that I've figured all of the answers, just I'd love to hear other things that other MSPs would love to know about as we continue the interview process.
Yeah. What's the most specific pivot or evolution in either your thinking or your decision of what you need to solve for now, because you now know what you didn't know before through this process?
I think the most specific is really that this caught me by surprise. We've always hired neurodivergent, unconventional, right, in a very different way. And so I always hire for the trajectory. In other words, hire amazing people and get out of their way. And even so, I think I was still in their way. I had these linear expectations. And I need to get out of the way further and say, like, this is what we need. Here's a laundry list of things we need as a company to achieve. And, we get 2 leads a month and you figured out a way to generate 100. You could slash ticket resolution time, not by 5%, but by 50. Like there's just so many things I thought too small is the short answer. I need to get out of the way and say, look, here's the problems. I'm not sure you can fix a lot of them, but the right person can show up and go, hold on, using
Yeah.
systems thinking, using this great big lever, using my wisdom, I can do these things. And again, like people did in 3 days what I thought would have taken more than 3 months.
Yeah.
And this is somebody with over a decade of software. I have over a decade, actually over 20 years of managing software development. So it's not my first go around with, estimating levels of effort.
Sure.
And even I was blown away. How do we do 3 months of work in 3 days?
Yeah. That's a good lesson to take away, is to take the constraints off of our own level of thinking for the vision, right? Thinking bigger. I feel like I probably walk away from every single day almost now with that lesson too. And so I can definitely relate. That one resonates big.
Yeah. Get out of my own way. That's the big thing, right? Thinking too small.
Right. Now I need to design an agent to have that conversation with you so that you can get out of your own way in a different way, right?
Yeah.
With different context. So,
yeah. Please.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. We're at the top of the hour. It always goes by quick. I didn't peek to see if there were any questions we could rip off quick, but
yeah, I appreciate that. No, we'll have to get to those and dig in more next time. So I just have been immersed in the conversation. Thank you for the wonderful questions. And for anybody that would like to drop other questions or comments, love to get those and be prepared to talk about those 2 weeks from now next time.
Awesome. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thank you.